So now we're going to be dealing with, can we write the equation of sine or cosine shifted to the left or to the right? So before we begin, I do want to just bring up, what is that phase shift all about? So if you remember from quadratics, if you have, let's just say, let's just leave it as x squared, I don't know, plus 2. So it's shifted up 2, right, on our parabola here. If I want to shift it to the right 2, I'm going to put minus 2. Remember, it does the opposite of what you think it would do on the inside. Minus 2 puts it to the right 2, minus 3 puts it to the right 3, and so on. If you put plus 2, now it's shifting it off to the left, or plus 3 shifts it off to the left 3. Same idea works for sine. If I take sine of x and I put plus 3, what it's going to do is it's going to shift it to the right 3, or left 3. And if I put minus 3, now it's shifted to the right 3. And it's kind of hard to pay attention. There's the midline right there. So there it is at 3. Remember, before we put that start is at the origin. So it's just been shifted over to the right 3. So we need to also remember what's our basic sine, what's our basic cosine. And honestly, this assignment's not that difficult if you have everything in the past down. But if you don't, then sometimes this all kind of adds up. You get a little bit lost in some of these little details and things. So sine and cosine. Remember, sine starts on the midline. It has to go through a hill and a valley. If we were going to take this and cut it into quarters, you would see here's our first quarter, second quarter, and this is all based on the unit circle, third quarter and fourth quarter. So breaking into quarters is going to help. Cosine. Notice cosine starts on the maximum or the minimum. And the way it's broken into quarters, so there's our period here. So the way it's broken into quarters right here is 1/4. Then we get our next fourth, then our next fourth, and then our last fourth there. So that's it broken down into quarters there. And you can break it down the same way on these other two. They're just flipped upside down to the same thing. So let's look at this first one. We're going to be writing our equation of the line here of the form, just like you see here, and figuring out C. Now that is going to be a little bit tricky. I'll show you how we're going to deal with that. And so what are they given? Let's look at what they're given. They're giving us a maximum. So I think we're going to go with cosine because we're starting on the maximum. That's the leftmost point. So cosine. Let's figure out the midline. So the midline, we have the average of the y values. So for the midline, we're just add those up and divide by 2. And I get -1/2, and that makes sense. Let me just draw that right there at -1/2. That would be the midline. So we're going to put plus, or not plus, it's minus. It's shifted down 1/2. -1/2. So the amplitude is our distance to that midline. So a couple different ways we can get this figured out. One way is we could find the distance between 2 and -3. What's that total distance here? What is our total distance from the top to the bottom and cut it in half? Or we can just find our distance to the midline. Up to you. I'm going to find the total distance and cut it in half. So I'm going to do 2 minus -3 over 2, which is 5 over 2. So remember, this is all just based on different situations. Each problem is going to be different depending upon what you're given. As long as you know amplitude is that distance to the midline, how are you going to find that distance? That's what we care about. So the total distance is 5. We're cutting it in half, which is 5/2, or 2.5. If we want to put this in decimals, I'm fine with that. Let's do that. It's a little bit cleaner. And I'll change the 1/2 to 0.5. Okay, now let's figure out the period. And if you struggle with this, go a couple lessons back. So the period is going to be the length from, let me pick a color we haven't done yet, from maximum to maximum. Since we're starting on the maximum, remember, if it was sine starting in the midline, we got to go through a hill and a valley. But since we're cosine, we're starting the maximum, we want this horizontal length here. And so that length, well, let's take a look at the points we do have. So I'm going to erase this. And we can figure out half that distance if you look right here. And that's why I said break it into quarters. Sometimes it's a quarter of the distance they give us. But this case, it's half that distance. Is from -4 to -1. So for our period, it's going to equal double that. So we're going to do -4 minus -1, or -1 minus -4, which equals 3. So the total distance is going to be 6. So our period's 6. Now, realize the period is not what goes in front of x. It's actually, remember, it's b, and b is different. So if you remember, the period is 2 pi over b. So we want b, because it's bx. Remember? That's what we see here. I'm using capital letters because that's what we've been doing. So kind of this is like the one trick here, coming up with that period. Period equals 6, so 6 equals 2 pi over b. So we're going to go ahead and just cross multiply and solve this. So 6b equals 2 pi. Let me give a little more space here. So b equals 2 pi over 6, which is pi over 3. So that's what's going to go in front of x. And that we pretty much have done all the hard work. Just put a little more space there. Okay, so here's kind of the key thing. You're going to do an extra set of parentheses because C is not really the shift to the left or to the right. It's actually C divided by B. You have to factor out the B first to see that shift. So in order to see the shift left or right, you got to factor B out. You got to divide B out. So when we write this, I'm just going to put that in the front. And actually, I think Con will accept it this way with the double parentheses, so you don't even have to mess with it. But how much did we shift to the left? So normally our cosine starts right on the y-axis. So we're shifted to the left 4. So I'm going to put, since it went to the left, plus 4. Now you could distribute this back for a final answer, 2.5 cosine of pi over 3x plus 4 pi over 3. If you want to, either one, they're going to accept either answer. But that's the main idea. So we find the midline, find the amplitude. That shouldn't be a big deal. If it's flipped upside down, by the way, it's going to be a negative out front. So be careful with that. That's if it was, you know, if you're looking at these two on the right. If it's going through the valley first, or if it starts on the minimum, then it's flipped upside down. Need the negative out front. The hard part's the period. Once you find the period, setting it equal to 2 pi over b to find b. Because remember, the period is not what goes in front of x, it's b that goes in front of x. So you are going to have to set it equal, cross multiply, and solve for b. Not that big of a deal, just the bigger deal is remembering that you don't want to put a 6 in front of x, because that's not the period, that's not what b is, that's what the period is. And so once you put it all together, it's not too bad. Let me go ahead and close this gap. We'll take a look at this one. Why don't I do one more of these writing ones. This one, I'll go a little bit faster this time. So let's find the midline. So this time they gave us a point on the midline. So we know that our midline, I used green, our midline is going to be -4. That's easy because that's the y value. Let me go ahead and draw a line going through that. There you go. So that's our midline. That's nice. So what's our amplitude? Our amplitude is going to be that distance to the midline, right? So let's find this distance to the midline. So that's going to be -4 is the greater value minus -5.5, which is going to equal 1.5. So that's our amplitude. Now, is this flipped? Well, let's figure out. Okay, so we're starting on the bottom, right? We're starting on the minimum. We're not starting the midline. Sine would start on the midline. We're starting on the minimum, so this is going to be cosine. And since it's the minimum, it's not just going to be positive cosine, it's going to be negative cosine. And we know our amplitude is 1.5. Remember, we set up the extra set of parentheses there. And then -4 at the end for our midline. Okay. So we want to end for our period, we want to end on the other minimum, right? So we got to figure out what is this length here. So this is only a quarter of the way. So the period, or not the period, but that length here is only a quarter of the way. So let's figure out what that is. That's going to be pi minus pi over 4, which is 4 pi over 4 minus pi over 4. So that's going to be 3 pi over 4. Seems kind of crazy, but that 3 pi over 4, that's a quarter of the way. So if we have that 4 times multiplied by 4, our period is going to equal 3 pi over 4. But remember, that's not what b is. 2 pi over b is equal to our period. So I'm going to go ahead and cross multiply that. And that's just like what I did up here. I just said p equals that, and then I substitute 6 in for p. I'm doing it a little bit different this time, saying p equals 3 pi over 4, and I'm substituting in the 2 pi over p. Because you got to remember that, you know what, maybe I should do this. Cross multiply. So b equals 8 over 3. And that's what's going to go right here. Which way did we shift? We shifted to the right. See how the minimum would normally start on the y-axis? We shifted to the right, so I'm going to put minus pi over 4. Your choice if you want to distribute it. I think Khan accepts either way. It did last year. 8 over 4 is 2. Pi over 3. You can think of that as 8 over 12. And simplify 8 over 12 to 2 over 3. And there we go. All right. So that's the idea. Let me see one of these. Okay, so what you want to do with this one is you want to just pay careful attention. We've had a similar assignment before. That one of these points they're given is the midline point. This is a midline point. And this one's your max or min. So like with cosine, you're going to want to switch those around because cosine starts on its maximum or minimum. So you're going to want to flip those around. So make sure you do that with cosine. So let me see. So we know that our midline is -3. So let me go ahead and put a line there. So that means that this point is going to fall on that line, -3. Then our amplitude is 4. It is positive, so we know because it's positive, it's going to do the hill first and then the valley and end on the midline like that. And then a quarter of the way we'll get to its maximum. So we are going to find a fourth of the period and figure out, and let me do that in green actually, because that's what color the points are on con, right? That we can see it. So just so you have a plan on sine, we're starting on the midline, then going to the maximum a quarter of the way through. That's why earlier I divided this up into quarters, right? So we can see those quarters. All right, so first though, before we start plotting where that's going to go, we got to see, did this shift to the left or to the right? So let's figure that out. So we currently have 4 sine of 0.5 plus, 0.5x plus pi. So if I factor out 0.5 to the front, just on the inside, I'm just going to focus on the inside, ignore everything else, act like it doesn't exist. So that's going to be x plus pi divided by 0.5. And then pi, how many times is 0.5 going to 1? It's just going to be dividing by a half, flip and multiply. It's going to be 2. So that's going to be x plus 2 pi. So this is going to shift to the left 2 pi. So right here is actually where I'm going to put that midline, that first midline point. And we know our amplitude is 4. So I'm going to go up 4 from that spot. Which from -3 up 4 would be 1. So I'm going to go up 4 from that spot. So on that line is going to be our next point. Just, I don't know how far to the right to take it. I need a quarter of the period. So let's figure out what the period is. So the period is 2 pi over b, and in this case b is 0.5, which divided by a half, it's going to be 8 pi. So we want a quarter of that. A quarter of the period is going to be 2 pi. So we're going to go 2 pi to the right. That's where our quarter is going to end up. So our other point is going to be placed right here. Kind of a lot of work because we want a quarter of the period. This one's the same idea. Factoring out that pi over 2, I just wanted to show you real quick how to do that. So factoring it out to the outside means you divide by it, which means you got to flip and multiply. So that's over 1. So you're going to have pi over 1 times 2 over pi, which equals 2. So the inside there and that's it. Cosine, same idea. Just start on the maximum, go to the midline, make sure those are switched around.